It's 3 in the morning on October 15th, 1927, outside a small town called Kirkuk in northern Iraq. A drilling crew working for a British-run company called the Turkish Petroleum Company has been fighting a stubborn well for 6 months. They've named it Baba Gurgur No. 1. Just after midnight, the drill bit punches through a layer of limestone more than 1,500 feet down, and something starts to go very wrong very fast. Pressure builds. The casing groans. And then, with a roar the crew can hear from miles away, oil erupts out of the ground and shoots roughly 140 feet into the night sky, a black geyser taller than a 15-story building. It doesn't stop. For days, the well spews oil uncontrollably, flooding the desert, threatening to drown nearby villages, filling ravines, forcing families to flee before engineers finally managed to cap it. That well would go on to anchor one of the largest oil fields ever discovered on Earth. And here's the part that should stop you in your tracks. 9 years earlier, almost nobody in London even wanted this land. When British generals were racing to grab territory in the final days of the First World War, Mosul was an afterthought, a dusty, half-forgotten Ottoman province that had already been promised to France on paper. Nobody in the War Office was thinking about oil fields when British cavalry rode into Mosul in the autumn of 1918. They were thinking about grain, about strategic depth, about denying the retreating Turks a place to regroup. The oil came later. The empire came first. And by the time anyone realized what was actually sitting underneath that patch of desert, Britain had already spent 7 years, a small war, a League of Nations arbitration, and no small amount of diplomatic sleight of hand making sure it belonged to them. This is the story of how Britain ended up owning a province it barely understood, how a handshake in a London drawing room rewrote a border that had been drawn in a completely different agreement, and how the discovery of oil turned a minor colonial afterthought into one of the most consequential land grabs of the 20th century, one whose fault lines are still visible on a map of the Middle East today. The race nobody was supposed to win. To understand how Mosul ended up British, you have to go back to the final weeks of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire, Germany's ally, was collapsing on every front. By October 1918, Ottoman forces were in retreat across Mesopotamia, worn down by years of brutal campaigning along the Tigris and Euphrates. On October 30th, 1918, an Ottoman delegation boarded the British warship HMS Agamemnon, anchored in Mudros Harbor on the Greek island of Lemnos, and signed an armistice with Britain. The guns in the Middle East were supposed to fall silent at noon the following day. Here's where it gets interesting, and where the story of Mosul actually begins. At the moment the armistice took effect, British forces under General William Marshall were still short of Mosul city. The armistice terms were vague enough that Marshall saw an opening, and by his own account in letters home, he was determined to take it. He argued that the surrounding region, rich in grain and livestock, was needed to supply his army, and London gave him the green light. So in direct defiance of the spirit, if not quite the letter, of an agreement that was supposed to have already ended the fighting, British troops kept marching. Over the following 2 weeks, they pushed north and occupied Mosul city itself, completing their hold on the wider province by the middle of November, roughly 2 weeks after the ceasefire was supposed to have frozen everyone in place. Turkish nationalists never forgot this. For the better part of the next century, they would describe the taking of Mosul as an outright violation of the armistice, a land grab dressed up as military necessity. And on the narrow question of timing, they had a point. Mosul was Ottoman territory when the guns were supposed to stop, and it was British territory 2 weeks later. That single fact would haunt Anglo-Turkish relations for the next 8 years and would eventually land on the desk of an international tribunal in Geneva. But to understand why Britain wanted Mosul badly enough to bend the rules for it, you have to rewind even further, to a secret agreement signed 2 years earlier that had already promised this exact same territory to somebody else entirely. A province promised twice. In 1916, while the war was still raging and an Ottoman collapse was far from guaranteed, British and French diplomats sat down and quietly carved up the Ottoman Middle East between themselves, in case they won. The men who drew the lines were a British diplomat named Mark Sykes and a French counterpart named François-Georges Picot, and the agreement that bears their names became one of the most notorious documents in modern Middle Eastern history. Under Sykes-Picot, the Mosul region was assigned not to direct British control, but to a French sphere of influence, part of a proposed Arab state that would sit under French protection. That arrangement made sense in 1916, when Britain and France were desperate allies who needed to keep each other happy and had no idea how the war would actually end. But by the autumn of 1918, With Ottoman power in the region shattered and British troops occupying nearly the entire territory in question, the calculation had changed completely. British officials looked at the map and did not like what they saw. They had done almost all of the fighting in Mesopotamia. Their armies controlled Baghdad, Basra, and now Mosul. And under the terms of a 2-year-old agreement, they were supposed to hand a large, strategically important chunk of it over to the French. So on December 1st, 1918, just 3 weeks after British troops finished occupying Mosul, Prime Minister David Lloyd George sat down with the French Premier Georges Clemenceau at the French Embassy in London to sort out exactly this problem. According to Lloyd George's own later account of the meeting, Clemenceau asked him directly what Britain actually wanted out of the post-war settlement in the Middle East. Lloyd George's answer, in essence, was simple: Mosul. Clemenceau, eager to secure British backing for French ambitions elsewhere, particularly in Syria and along the Rhine in Europe, agreed to hand it over. In exchange, Britain would support an expanded French mandate over Syria and would drop its own claims to territory France wanted there. It is worth sitting with how casually this happened. A province containing hundreds of thousands of people, an ancient city with roots stretching back to antiquity, and as it would soon turn out, one of the richest oil deposits on the planet, changed hands over the course of a short conversation between two men in a London drawing room, as part of a broader trade that also touched on Palestine and Syria. There was no referendum. There was no consultation with the people who actually lived in Mosul. It was decided the way so much of the modern Middle East's borders were decided in this era, by two exhausted European empires dividing the spoils of a war that had just ended, with barely a passing thought for the people whose lives would be reshaped by the stroke of a pen. France did not walk away from Mosul with nothing, though. It's here that oil enters the story for the first time, years before anyone had actually found any. Even before drilling began, there was already serious speculation, based on surface seepages and old surveys, that the region around Mosul sat on significant petroleum reserves. A company called the Turkish Petroleum Company, an Anglo-German venture originally formed before the war to pursue Ottoman oil concessions, had a complicated ownership history. Britain had seized the German shareholding as enemy property during the war. So when France agreed to give up its claim to Mosul's territory, British negotiators offered something in return: a share of any oil that might eventually be found there, sealing the oil deal before a single barrel existed. This arrangement was formalized through a series of agreements over the following 18 months, culminating in what's known as the San Remo Oil Agreement, signed on April 24, 1920, at an international conference held in the Italian resort town of San Remo. Negotiated primarily by a British oil executive named Sir John Cadman and a French official named Philippe Berthelot, the agreement handed France the 25% stake in the Turkish Petroleum Company that had previously belonged to German interests. The remaining shares were split largely between British-controlled companies. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, the forerunner of BP, held roughly half, and Royal Dutch Shell held a quarter. Think about what actually happened here for a moment. Two European governments sat down and formally divided up the profits from an oil industry that did not yet exist, in a country that had not yet been created, based on oil fields that had not yet been discovered. It was speculation dressed up as diplomacy, a bet placed years before anyone knew whether it would pay off. And it very nearly blew up the wartime alliance between Britain and France before it was settled. According to multiple accounts from the period, tensions over Mesopotamian oil grew so heated during the broader Paris peace negotiations that Lloyd George and Clemenceau reportedly came close to a genuine falling out over the issue, reportedly requiring President Woodrow Wilson to step in and calm things down. There was one more party furious about being left out entirely: the United States. American oil companies and the U.S. State Department watched the San Remo carve-up with real alarm. Washington had fought the war too, and American officials were increasingly uneasy about watching Britain and France quietly divide up the world's future oil supply between themselves under a policy that seemed to shut everyone else out. The U.S. government formally refused to recognize the San Remo Agreement as binding and spent much of the early 1920s pressuring London to open the door to American oil interests. That pressure would not fully pay off for American companies until 1928, but was already simmering in the background as early as 1920, and it would eventually reshape who actually controlled Iraqi oil, ruling a country nobody asked to be part of. With the French claim settled, Britain now had to figure out what to actually do with the vast stretch of former Ottoman territory it had won, roughly corresponding to the three Ottoman provinces of Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul. In 1920, the League of Nations formally granted Britain a mandate over this territory, now to be called Iraq. On paper, a mandate was supposed to be a form of temporary guardianship, preparing a territory for eventual self-rule. In practice, for the people living under it, it looked an awful lot like colonial administration with a new coat of paint. Iraqis were not thrilled about this arrangement, and in the summer of 1920, that frustration exploded into a full-scale revolt. Tribal leaders, urban nationalists, and religious figures across both Sunni and Shia communities rose up against British rule in a rebellion that spread rapidly through the Euphrates Valley. Putting it down took months of hard fighting, cost Britain a substantial number of casualties, and ran up a bill that horrified a British public and parliament already exhausted by the financial toll of the First World War. It was one of the most expensive and politically costly colonial uprisings Britain faced in the interwar period, and it forced a serious rethink in London about how the new territory should actually be governed. The answer British officials settled on was indirect rule through a friendly local monarch. In 1921, at a conference in Cairo chaired by the colonial secretary Winston Churchill, British officials selected Faisal ibn Hussein, a member of the Hashemite dynasty who had led Arab forces during the wartime revolt against the Ottomans, to become king of Iraq. Faisal had actually already tried and failed to rule as king of Syria, having been pushed out by French forces the year before. Now Britain installed him on a new throne in Baghdad, in a kingdom whose borders, army, and finances were still heavily shaped by British advisors behind the scenes. Faisal was a genuine political operator with real ambitions of his own, not simply a puppet, but there was no mistaking where ultimate power still resided. And Faisal, it turned out, wanted Mosul just as badly as the British did, for reasons of his own. A kingdom without its northern province, and without the oil that was rumored to lie beneath it, will be a far weaker and poorer state, and Faisal knew that holding on to Mosul was essential if he hoped to build any real authority and undercut the nationalist critics who accuse him of being a foreign puppet. So on this particular question, at least, the interests of the British Empire and the new Iraqi monarchy lined up almost perfectly. The treaty that left the question open. There was still one enormous problem. Turkey had not given up. By 1923, the old Ottoman Empire was gone, replaced by a new Turkish republic under Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, who had fought a hard war of independence against Allied occupation and Greek invasion. Ataturk's new government had laid out its territorial vision in a document called the National Pact, and that document explicitly claimed Mosul as rightfully Turkish territory, part of the Ottoman homeland that should never have been separated from the rest of Anatolia. When the Allied powers and the new Turkish Republic finally sat down to negotiate a comprehensive peace treaty at Lausanne, Switzerland, the Mosul question turned out to be one of the thorniest issues on the table. Turkey wanted it back. Britain, now firmly entrenched with a mandate, an installed king, and an oil deal already sketched out, had absolutely no intention of giving it up. The two sides argued for months and simply could not reach an agreement. Rather than let the entire peace treaty collapse over a single disputed province, the negotiators essentially punted. The Treaty of Lausanne, signed in July 1923, stated that Britain and Turkey would try to settle the border between Turkey and Iraq through direct negotiation within 9 months, and if that failed, the dispute would be handed over to the Council of the League of Nations for a final decision. 9 months came and went. Britain and Turkey met, argued, and got nowhere. So, exactly as the treaty had anticipated, the fate of Mosul was formally referred to the League of Nations in the summer of 1924, the first time in its short history that the fledgling international body would be asked to settle a major territorial dispute between two sovereign states. Geneva decides. The League responded by sending a fact-finding commission, led by a Hungarian count and staffed with representatives from several countries, to travel through the disputed region, survey local opinion, and interview officials on both sides. This was, in its own way, a genuinely novel experiment. An international body was attempting to determine sovereignty over territory not through war or backroom deal-making, but through investigation and arbitration, at least in theory. In July 1924, the Commission delivered its report, and it came down in Iraq's, and by extension Britain's, favor, recommending that the border follow what was known as the Brussels Line, drawn back in 1924 as a provisional demarcation. The League Council formally endorsed this recommendation in October 1924. Turkey was furious and refused to accept the ruling, at one point threatening to use military force to reclaim the province if necessary. Tensions ran high enough along the frontier over the following year that some officials genuinely feared renewed war. To settle the legal question of whether the League Council's decision was even truly binding, the matter was referred to the Permanent Court of International Justice, the League's judicial arm and forerunner to today's International Court of Justice. The court ruled that yes, a unanimous decision of the Council, excluding the self-interested votes of Britain and Turkey themselves, would carry full binding force. With that legal question resolved, the League Council formally awarded the entire Mosul province to Iraq on December 16, 1925. Turkey, isolated diplomatically and unwilling to risk a fresh war so soon after fighting for its very independence, ultimately backed down. On June 5, 1926, Turkey signed a tripartite treaty with Britain and Iraq, formerly known as the Treaty of Ankara, accepting Mosul's inclusion within Iraq once and for all. It was not a total loss for Turkey, though. As part of the settlement, Iraq agreed to hand over 10% of any government oil royalties earned from the Mosul region to Turkey for the next 25 years, a face-saving consolation prize that acknowledged, without quite saying so out loud, that everyone involved already suspected there was serious money buried under that province. They were right, and they were about to find out just how right. The gusher that changed the calculation. Remember that well from the opening of this video, Baba Gurgur No. 1? Its story actually begins 2 years before the gusher, in March 1925, when the Turkish Petroleum Company finally secured a formal 75-year concession from the Iraqi government to explore and develop oil across a huge swath of the country. A joint geological survey team, staffed with experts from Britain, France, and the United States, began field work, and drilling on the Baba Gurgur site started in April 1927. 6 months later came the blowout. On October 15, 1927, the well struck oil at extraordinary pressure, producing an estimated flow that would later be measured at around 95,000 barrels a day once controlled, an almost unheard-of figure for the era. It would go on to be recognized for the next 2 decades as the largest single oil field ever discovered anywhere on the planet, a record it held until an even larger field was found in Saudi Arabia in 1948. Kirkuk, the city nearest the field, will become permanently and inextricably linked with oil wealth, and also, in the decades that followed, with fierce and often violent competition over who actually controlled it. Suddenly, everything that Britain had spent nearly a decade negotiating over, the diplomatic maneuvering with France, the League of Nations arbitration, the treaty with Turkey, was no longer a bet on a hypothetical. It was confirmed. And confirmation meant that everyone who had been shut out of the deal now wanted back in, especially the Americans. Mr. 5% and the red line. Washington had never stopped pressing the issue since San Remo. American oil companies, backed by a State Department that argued for an open-door policy, giving all nations fair access to mandate territory resources, spent years lobbying and negotiating for a share of Iraqi oil. With the Baba Gurgur discovery proving beyond doubt just how valuable the concession actually was, the pressure finally paid off. On July 31, 1928, representatives of the major oil companies involved met in Ostend, Belgium, and hammered out what became known as the Red Line Agreement. Under its terms, ownership of the Turkish Petroleum Company was reorganized into 4 equal blocks of 23.75% each. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, representing British interests, Royal Dutch Shell, the French company Française de Pétroles, and a newly formed American consortium called the Near East Development Corporation, which brought together Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of New York, and other major American firms. The final 5% went to a single individual, Kalust Gulbenkian, an Armenian-British businessman who had helped assemble the original Turkish Petroleum Company decades earlier and had shrewdly held onto a personal stake ever since. That 5% sliver would eventually make Gulbenkian one of the wealthiest private individuals in the world and earn him the nickname history remembers him by, Mr. 5%. The agreement got its name from a literal red line that Gulbenkian is said to have drawn on a map during the negotiations, tracing the old boundaries of the Ottoman Empire as he remembered them from before the war. Every company that signed the agreement bound itself to a self-denial clause. None of them could pursue oil exploration anywhere inside that red line except jointly, through the same consortium structure. It was, in effect, a cartel, one designed to prevent any single company or country from breaking away and developing Middle Eastern oil independently. In 1929, reflecting its new international ownership and its new focus, the Turkish Petroleum Company changed its name to the Iraq Petroleum Company, and it would dominate the country's oil industry for more than 4 decades. From the desert to the sea, discovering the oil and dividing up the ownership was only half the challenge. Iraq is landlocked in the areas where the oil was found, and getting crude from Kirkuk to a market meant building serious infrastructure across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. Survey work for a pipeline began in 1928, and construction followed over the next several years, eventually running 2 parallel lines westward across the desert to Mediterranean ports, one terminating at Haifa in British Mandate Palestine, the other at Tripoli in French Mandate Lebanon, a split route that itself reflected the delicate Anglo-French balance struck a decade earlier. By the mid-1930s, Iraqi crude was finally flowing to international markets in serious volume, and the country that had been a demographic afterthought in a secret 1916 map had become a genuine pillar of the global oil economy. Iraq gained formal independence from the British Mandate in 1932, becoming the first Mandate territory in the region to do so and joining the League of Nations in its own right. But independence came with heavy strings attached. Under a 1930 treaty negotiated ahead of that transition, Britain retained military bases inside Iraq, continued influence over its foreign policy, and crucially kept the oil concession structure exactly as it was. Iraq was sovereign on paper. In practice, the country that had been fought over, divided, and arbitrated into existence remained deeply entangled with the empire that had shaped its birth, an arrangement that would fuel Iraqi nationalist resentment for decades and would not be fully unwound until the Iraq Petroleum Company was finally nationalized by the Iraqi government in 1972, 44 years after that meeting in Ostend. What this story actually tells us. Step back and look at the whole arc of this. In November 1918, Mosul was a minor prize that British commanders grabbed almost as an afterthought in the final days of a world war, defying the technical terms of an armistice to get there first. For the next several years, its fate was decided almost entirely by people who never set foot in it. A British prime minister trading it away in a London drawing room, French and British oil executives dividing hypothetical profits at a resort in Italy, judges in Geneva parsing legal technicalities about arbitration, and finally American oil executives elbowing their way into a deal they had spent a decade complaining about being excluded from. Nobody who actually lived in Mosul or in the villages around Kirkuk or in Baghdad had a meaningful say in any of it. And yet the decisions made in those rooms thousands of miles away, by men who were often working for maps rather than first-hand knowledge, drew a border that still exists today, created a country that still exists today, and set off a scramble for resources whose consequences are still being argued over today. Kirkuk itself remains one of the most fiercely contested pieces of territory in modern Iraq, still a flashpoint between Kurdish, Arab, and Turkmen communities, its status still unresolved in Iraqi politics a full century after that gusher first roared into the sky. There's a version of this story people like to tell where oil explains everything, where Britain fought for Mosul purely because it already knew what was down there. The actual record is messier and, honestly, more unsettling than that. Britain grabbed Mosul first for reasons that had almost nothing to do with oil, and only afterward built an entire diplomatic architecture, treaties, arbitration, secret agreements, especially installed king, to make sure it could keep whatever turned out to be underneath it. The empire didn't chase the oil. The oil arrived after the empire had already claimed the ground, and once it did, every single decision that followed, the League of Nations ruling, the Red Line Agreement, the pipeline routes, the postponed independence, bent itself around protecting that discovery. That is arguably the more honest and more chilling version of the story. The borders of the modern Middle East were not drawn around oil. Oil was found underneath borders that had already been drawn for entirely different reasons, and then everyone spent the next 50 years making sure those borders never moved. That's the story of how a province nobody particularly wanted in 1918 became one of the most fought-over patches of ground in the 20th century, and how a single gusher outside Kirkuk confirmed, in the most literal way imaginable, that the empire had gambled correctly. If you made it this far, you clearly like this kind of deep dive into the history nobody teaches in school, so there's going to be a lot more of it here. Hit subscribe if you want to catch the next one. It genuinely helps this channel keep going and keep making videos like this. And I'm curious about something. This channel has viewers scattered all over the map, so drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, what city or state you're texting this from right now. I want to see just how far this thing actually reaches. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.